Welcome back to the Deep Dive. We're so glad you could join us here on the English Bookcast channel.
Today, we are really getting into a foundational text, one that, honestly, it changes how you look at the world. It's Biopiracy, The Plunder of Nature and Knowledge by Vandana Shiva.
That's right. And it's a book that feels more relevant now than ever. Our mission today is to really unpack the core arguments she lays out right at the start, in her introduction, which she calls The Second Coming of Columbus, and then all of Chapter 1, Knowledge, Creativity, and Intellectual Property Rights.
And we have to be really clear about her central claim from the get-go. She's arguing that modern intellectual property rights, or IPRs, especially when they're applied to life forms, to genes, they're not really about rewarding innovation.
Not all.
No. She says they are a new, legally sanctioned form of colonial plunder. She literally calls it piracy through patents.
So to get our heads around that, we have to start where she does, which is, surprisingly, not in a modern biotech lab.
No, we have to go back.
Oh.
500 years back.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
We need to look at the original architecture of conquest, because she argues that what's happening now is basically just a high-tech version of the same old playbook.
That's the core of it.
So the book opens with this really powerful historical parallel. It goes all the way back to 1492,
Yeah.
to Christopher Columbus.
Right. And the privileges he was granted by the Spanish crown, by Queen Isabel and King Ferdinand.
And these weren't just, go explore privileges. They were explicitly the privileges of discovery and conquest.
Yes. And that word conquest is key. But for it to be legitimate, it needed more than just a royal seal of approval. It needed a higher authority.
Divine authority.
Divine authority. And that came a year later, 1493, with Pope Alexander VI Bull of Donation. This was, for all intents and purposes, the legal and moral license for a global takeover.
So what did it actually say? What did this papal bull do?
It literally drew a line on the map, an imaginary line down the Atlantic, 100 leagues west of the Azores. And it granted the Spanish and Portuguese monarchs the rights to all lands discovered, or, to be discovered, on one side of that line.
Provided they weren't already ruled by another Christian king.
Exactly. That was the only condition.
And this document, which sounds so ancient, contained the legal DNA for everything that followed.
It absolutely did. Shiva breaks it down into 3 key legal components that basically turned piracy into a divine mission. The first was this principle of effective occupation by Christian princes.
Meaning, if you're a Christian ruler and you plant a flag, you can claim it.
Essentially, yes, your presence established sovereignty.
But wait, these lands weren't empty. You had complex civilizations, the Aztecs, the Incas, countless nations across the Americas. How did they just legally bypass that fact?
Well, that's the second component, and it's the most chilling one. It's the legal fiction of Terra Nullius.
Land belonging to no one.
Literally. The logic, if you can call it that, was that if the people living there were not Christian, they weren't fully human in a legal sense. Therefore, their claim to the land was invalid. The land was, for legal purposes, vacant, empty, ready to be claimed.
That's an incredible act of legal erasure.
It is. And the third piece was the moral justification. The monarchs were given a duty to bring the so-called savages into the Christian fold. Conquest wasn't just a right, it was a religious duty.
So the system is designed to make the victim completely invisible. The theft isn't theft if the person you're stealing from doesn't legally exist in your framework.
Precisely. And the consequences of that framework, the source lays them out in stark numbers.
They're staggering.
This legal idea of terra nullius led directly to the subjugation and, in many cases, extermination of entire peoples. The Native American population is estimated to have been around 72 million in 1492.
And a few centuries later.
It was less than 4 million. The freedom and property that the colonizers claimed was built directly on the erasure of the people who had lived on and with that land for millennia.
And this is where the book makes that giant leap. From a history lesson to a present-day indictment, Shiva says this is the second coming of colonization, the same structure, just in a new, secular, corporate form.
The parallel she draws is exact. The old instruments of power are just replaced with new ones, so you don't need the papal bull anymore.
What do you have instead?
You have the General Agreement on Tariffs and Tradegate TT, now enforced by the World Trade Organization. That's the new global legal foundation.
Okay, and the effective occupation by Christian princes. What's the modern equivalent of that?
That's the work of transnational corporations, or TNCs. They're the ones establishing presence, supported by modern governments and global regulations that prioritize their property rights above all else.
And the most important piece, Terra Nullius, the empty land. How does that translate?
It's replaced by the idea of an empty life form, Nullius. The argument, often hidden in the language of biotechnology, is that a seed, a plant, a gene, it's just raw material. It's vacant of any real value or intellect until a corporation improves it with technology and capital.
So 1,000 years of farming and cultivation by indigenous communities counts for nothing.
It's legally invisible, just like the people were.
And that final piece, the duty to convert the savages.
That's now the duty to incorporate all local and national economies into the global marketplace, to bring all other forms of knowledge, traditional farming, herbal medicine, into the framework of Western commercial science, where it can be privatized and sold. The core action remains the same, creating property by taking the wealth of others.
This just sounds so fundamentally unjust. How was this ever rationalized philosophically? The book points to John Locke, right? His ideas on property.
Yes, Locke is absolutely central to understanding this. He provided the philosophical scaffolding that made this kind of appropriation seem like a natural right. This was during the inclusion movement in Europe.
Right, when common lands were being privatized.
Exactly. And Locke argued that property is created when you take something from nature, from the commons, and you mix your labor with it. That act of mixing gives you the right to own it.
Which on the surface sounds fair. If you work on it, it's yours.
It does, but here's the crucial twist that Shiva points out, the definition of labor. For Locke, it wasn't just, physical effort. It wasn't the work of a peasant tilling the soil.
So what was it?
It was labor in its spiritual form. And that, he argued, was expressed through capital, through investment. So when land was enclosed, it was the capital, the fences, the new equipment that was seen as the superior form of labor, overriding centuries of common use and cultivation.
So having money to invest became a higher moral right than actually working the land for generations?
Precisely. The consequence is that only the owners of capital were seen as having the natural right to own natural resources. This just swept aside the rights of peasants and tribes. For Locke, if land wasn't being improved by capital, it was essentially being wasted.
So if you're a tribe living sustainably on common land, and someone with capital comes to improve it, you're the one who's in the wrong for objecting. You're now the thief.
It's a complete inversion of justice. It's a philosophical license to steal, as long as you have the capital to develop what you've stolen. And that European capital-centric idea of property is what's now embedded in global patent law.
So we've moved from enclosing land to enclosing life itself. Shiva argues the new colonies are internal.
Yes, the frontier has moved inward. The ultimate colonies are now, as she puts it, the interior spaces of the bodies of women, plants, and animals, their genetic codes. Biotechnology allows capital to colonize life at the cellular level.
And the examples the book gives of this are, frankly, shocking. It's not abstract, it's about patenting human life.
They're deeply disturbing. Take the case of John Moore. He was a cancer patient, and his doctor, while treating him, developed a cell line from his tissue and patented it.
He patented his own patient's cells without his knowledge.
Without his knowledge or consent. It became a huge legal case. Does a person own their own biological material after it leaves their body? The system reduced his very being to a corporate asset.
And then there's the breast cancer gene.
Myriad Pharmaceuticals. They patented the BRCA1 and BRCA2 genes, which are linked to breast cancer. By owning the gene sequences, they tried to create a monopoly on all diagnostic testing.
So they tried to own a part of the human genome and control access to life-saving information.
That was the goal. And this extends globally to the most vulnerable populations.
Like the cases from Papua New Guinea and Panama.
Exactly. The book notes that the U.S. Commerce Secretary patented the cell lines of indigenous groups, the Hagahai and the Guami. These communities have unique genetic traits, and they're treated like, a natural resource to be mined, like their biology is Terra Nullius, vacant until discovered by a Western lab.
So once a corporation makes one of these claims, how is it enforced? How do they protect their monopoly?
This is where the state's power comes in. In the U.S., the Economic Espionage Act of 1996 is a key tool.
Which sounds like it's about stopping spies from stealing military secrets.
It sounds like that, but its scope is incredibly broad. The book highlights that it gives U.S. intelligence agencies the power to investigate the ordinary activities of people worldwide if they threaten the intellectual property of a U.S. corporation.
So an indigenous healer sharing traditional knowledge about a plant that a U.S. company has patented could be seen as a threat to national security.
That is the implication. Sharing knowledge, the very foundation of science and culture, becomes a criminal act if it undermines a corporate patent.
This brings us right back to that original colonial justification. The idea that indigenous people didn't improve their land.
It's the exact same logic. Back in the 17th century, colonizers like John Winthrop argued that since natives didn't build fences or use tame cattle, their land was unimproved and therefore available for the taking.
And now the argument is that a plant or a gene is unimproved until a corporation modifies it.
Yes. This is the jurisprudence of Bio Nullius. Life empty of intelligence. The philosophy is that the earth itself is just dead matter, and farmers, indigenous people, they have empty heads. Their millennia of knowledge isn't real science, it's not real innovation.
So evolutionary intelligence is denied? Cultural intelligence is denied?
Both are erased. The only yardstick for creation is the tool of genetic engineering in a Western lab. So a corporation can add one gene to a plant that a community has cultivated for 500 years and then claim they invented the entire organism. It's the ultimate act of piracy.
Okay, let's move into chapter 1 then, because this is where she really dismantles the core defense of this whole system, the argument that patents are necessary to spark creativity.
Right. The whole system is sold to us as this great catalyst for innovation. But Shiva's argument is that for life forms, it does the exact opposite. It actually stifles the creativity that's intrinsic to life and to the social production of knowledge.
So she's saying the system uses a dangerously narrow definition of what creativity even is.
Exactly. The system only recognizes one very specific, very commercial type. To see the damage, she says we have to recognize 3 distinct levels of creativity in the life sciences.
What's the first one?
The first and most basic is the inherent creativity of living organisms. Life itself, its ability to evolve, regenerate, diversify. That's the source of everything.
And the second level?
The creativity of indigenous communities. This is the collective, cumulative knowledge. Generations developing ways to conserve and use biodiversity for resilience and social good, not just for profit.
Okay, so the creativity of nature and the creativity of traditional cultures. What's the third?
The third is the only one the patent system values.
Yeah.
The creativity of modern scientists in a lab, finding ways to manipulate organisms to generate profit.
And the whole legal system is built to reward only that third, narrowest category.
Yes. It treats the first two, the source material of nature and the cultural knowledge about it, as free raw materials, ready for the taking. This creates what she calls a monoculture of knowledge.
A monoculture of knowledge. I like that phrase. It's like planting only one crop and wiping out all the diversity.
That's precisely the analogy. When you globalize IPRs through agreements like TRIPS at the WTO, you're forcing the entire world to adopt the U.S. patent system. You're actively displacing all other ways of knowing and sharing.
And the TRIPS agreement has specific rules that do this.
2 big ones. First, it only recognizes IPRs as private rights. This is huge. It means any knowledge created in the intellectual commons, in a village, in a public university, is legally unprotected and free for anyone to privatize.
So the lab that isolates a compound gets the patent, not the community that used the plant for centuries.
Right. It de-intellectualizes everyone but the corporation. The second rule is the profit filter. Article 27.1 of TRIPS says an innovation is only recognized if it's capable of industrial application.
So if it can't be mass-produced for profit, it doesn't count as innovation.
It doesn't count. An innovation for local food security, for ecological stability. Legally, it's worthless. And to make sure countries comply, the U.S. has this massive enforcement tool called the Special 301 Clause.
That's the hammer.
It's the hammer. It allows the U.S. to threaten any country that doesn't adopt these strict patent laws with massive trade sanctions.
Yeah.
It forces this monoculture on the entire world.
So given all that, how do the defenders of the system justify it? You hear this argument all the time, that without patents, creativity just withers.
It's a very powerful narrative, that without this protection, great ideas stay locked away, and that poverty is caused by a lack of IPR protection that makes people afraid to invent.
The book uses an anecdote to illustrate this, right? The New York salesman versus Carlos in Lima.
Yes, and it's a story IPR advocates love to tell. The salesman in New York, protected by strong patents, invents a valve, gets a loan, and builds a successful business. Proof the system works.
But then you have Carlos, the welder in Lima. He has a great idea for a simple car part.
A great, simple idea, but he doesn't develop it. Why? Because everyone around him says, don't bother, a bigger company will just steal it.
And the IPR advocates say, see, that's the problem. Carlos's fear, born from weak IPR laws, is what's causing poverty.
But this is where Shiva just flips the whole argument on its head. She says that interpretation completely ignores the real structural reasons for that inequality.
It's not about a lack of ideas in Lima.
Not at all. It's about 500 years of colonialism and a modern financial system that is constantly draining wealth from the global south to the north. That drain makes it impossible for them to ever build the capital to compete in this system in the first place.
The numbers on that drain are pretty stark.
They are unbelievable. The source points out that while the North gives about $50 billion a year in aid to the South,
Which sounds like a lot.
it does, but the South loses $500 billion a year, 10 times that amount, in debt payments and unfair trade terms. It's a constant, massive extraction of wealth.
So the system creates the poverty that prevents people like Carlos from competing. And then the system's defenders blame the victims for their lack of confidence.
It's a perfect closed loop. The IPR regime just becomes another tool to legally enforce that extraction of wealth, whether it's financial or biological.
So if patents aren't primarily about sparking invention in most industries, what is their real purpose? What's their main function?
Well, the evidence she presents suggests their main job is market control. It's about blocking your competitors.
Not about creating new things, but about stopping others from creating things.
In many cases, yes. Studies in the UK and the US found that outside of a couple of specific sectors, patents had a very, very small effect on the actual rate of invention.
But there was an exception, right?
Yes, and it's an important one to note: the chemical and pharmaceutical industries. There, patents were seen as essential for a huge majority of inventions, maybe 80%.
Because the research is expensive and the final product is easy to copy.
Exactly. But even there, the function quickly shifts from protecting an invention to building a monopoly. And when you apply this logic to life, to seeds, the result is devastating for competition.
You see a total consolidation of the industry.
A massive consolidation. All the small, independent seed companies that maintained incredible genetic diversity have been bought up by a handful of giant corporations. They now control the very foundation of our food supply.
And this creates a huge barrier for anyone else, right? A small company or a public university can't compete.
They can't. The big players patent key traits and processes and just freeze everyone else out. The seed, which was a common heritage for all of humanity, becomes a privately owned commodity you have to pay to access.
And you mentioned this has a corrosive effect on science itself.
A deeply corrosive effect. Science depends on the free exchange of ideas. Patents introduce the opposite: secrecy.
Scientists become afraid to share their work.
They're terrified of being scooped. The book quotes a biologist who says, "Colleagues who used to share everything now think twice before talking to anyone connected to a private company. Their life's work, their labor of love, could be turned into a commodity overnight."
So it just grinds the gears of scientific progress to a halt.
It chokes off the collaboration that discovery depends on, and this starves the public domain, what Shiva calls the intellectual commons. If you keep taking from that commons and never give back, eventually the whole tree of knowledge starts to die.
And the long-term cost of that is?
Yeah.
It's more than just slowing down research. It's about actively forgetting vital knowledge because it's not profitable.
This is one of the most frightening points in the chapter. Because the profit motor is the only thing that matters, funding flows to fields that can produce patents like molecular biology and other critical disciplines, ones we need for our survival. They just wither and die.
And the book is this one incredible, almost absurd example of this happening with earthworms.
The crisis in earthworm taxonomy. It sounds niche, but it's the perfect illustration. Earthworms are, they are absolutely essential. Darwin wrote a whole book about them. They build soil fertility. They are the engineers of healthy soil.
And you can't patent an earthworm doing its job.
You cannot. And so the science that supports understanding them is allowed to disappear. At the time the book was written, there was only one actively working taxonomist who knew North American earthworms.
One person for the entire continent.
One person. It's terrifying. Other experts in the field were working as, police lawyers or post office clerks because there was no funding. No one saw profit in it.
So the system that's supposed to drive innovation is actively causing the extinction of knowledge we need to, grow food and survive.
It's the enclosure mechanism in action. A lot of the basic science that leads to patents is publicly funded, but the rewards are all privately captured. And there's no process to put anything back to support the non-profitable foundational knowledge, so it just vanishes.
So as we wrap up this look at the introduction in Chapter 1, it's clear that biopiracy is laying out a massive indictment. Shiva's argument is that this isn't some new problem. It's the same colonial project, just with new legal tools.
And that transformation from Terra Nullius, empty land, to Bio Nullius, empty life, is the key. It's a legal trick that denies the inherent value and intelligence of nature and of culture so that capital can claim ownership.
So the fight against biopiracy isn't just about patents. It's framed here as a resistance to the, quote, ultimate colonization of life itself. It's about protecting both biological and cultural diversity from a system that only values one thing.
A system that's designed to turn everything into raw material, even as it makes the sources of that material legally invisible. It's a battle over the very definition of creativity and life.
It's a powerful and disturbing framework. Thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive into the start of Vandana Shiva's biopiracy. We are going to continue this analysis in our next deep dive. We'll get into Chapter 2, Can Life Be Made? Can Life Be Owned? Redefining biodiversity. We'll look at the philosophy behind genetic engineering and what it really means to try and own life itself.
And as you think about what we've discussed today about this enclosure of knowledge, and maybe you leave with this thought, if our economic system only recognizes and rewards property created through capital, what essential knowledge, like the knowledge of that last earthworm taxonomist, are we letting go extinct without even noticing? That knowledge is vanishing, and our system offers absolutely no reward for saving it. In this part of the analysis, we are plunging deep into the philosophical and economic machinery behind modern biopiracy, relying heavily on the stark realities laid out in the book Biopiracy, The Plunder of Nature and Knowledge.
Welcome. This is a critical deep dive because the core concepts we're tackling patents on life are fundamentally redefining what we understand as living organisms, who gets to own them, and, how that ownership impacts global ecological and cultural systems.
It's a huge topic.
It is. The text makes a powerful case that we are witnessing the enclosure of vital biological and cultural commons, which actively disrupts millennia-old regenerative cycles purely for corporate gain.
And for you, our listener, we are focusing specifically on the intellectual and agricultural foundations of this argument, analyzing chapters 2, 3, and 4 of the source material. These 3 chapters really connect the dots, don't they? They link the legal mechanisms of enclosure with the physical dispossession of farmers and communities.
That's a perfect breakdown. Chapter 2 sets the stage by challenging the scientific and philosophical foundations used to justify defining and patenting life itself.
Sort of the how did we even get here question.
Exactly. Then Chapter 3 moves to the practical realm, detailing the colonization of the seed and the destruction of the Earth's regenerative power in modern agriculture.
And Chapter 4.
Finally, Chapter 4 addresses the political conflict, contrasting biodiversity as a crucial local commons versus its forced conversion into global corporate raw material. This sequence, it reveals how intellectual theft gets codified into global policy.
Let's begin with the crucial questions posed in Chapter 2. Can life be made, and can it therefore be owned? The historical pivot point for this conversation is surprisingly recent, beginning in the 1970s?
That's right. You have to start with the landmark 1971 case involving General Electric and its employee, Anand Mohan Chakravarti.
Right, the oil-eating bacteria.
The very same. Chakravarti had engineered a Pseudomonas bacteria capable of breaking down crude oil, a potentially useful tool for cleaning up oil spills. And GE, of course, sought to patent this new microorganism.
And the argument that ultimately prevailed, even making it all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, was that this bacterium was an invention eligible for patent protection, not merely a product of nature, which is, typically unpatentable.
Correct. The legal reasoning hinges entirely on the manipulation of existing genetic material being defined as an act of creation or manufacture.
Even though the inventor himself is pretty honest about what he did.
He was. Chakravarti even admitted the limitations of his work, stating, and I'm quoting the source material here, "I simply shuffled genes, changing bacteria that already existed."
I mean, that sounds like an admission that should have undermined the patent claim.
You'd think so. But instead, it solidified the new legal reality that rearranging life's building blocks constitutes an invention.
So the legal system essentially accepted a minor modification as a complete creation.
It did. And that acceptance paved the way for the core critique found in this chapter, the hubris of creation. Key Smukes, commenting on this, noted that calling the bacteria Chakravarti's handiwork just wildly exaggerates human power.
And this is where that God move over or GMO mindset comes in.
Exactly. It's this reductionist mindset that allows corporations to claim invention over a self-reproducing life form, completely overlooking the organism's innate complexity and autonomy.
And what's interesting here is that to claim invention, you'd expect a complete understanding of the system being manipulated. Yet the source material argues that scientific ignorance often underpins these claims.
It's a profound contradiction. The text details that genetic manipulation often relies heavily on what is called junk DNA, sequences whose function is either unknown or currently misunderstood by molecular biologists.
So they're using parts they don't even understand to make their invention.
That's the point. The fact that researchers must include these random bits of nature to achieve successful results really undercuts the claim of pure invention.
Is there a specific example of how this reliance on the unknown played out?
The prime example is Tracy the sheep. Tracy was genetically engineered by scientists to produce a protein, alpha-1 antitrypsin, in her milk for pharmaceutical manufacturing.
Okay.
Initially, their attempts to get high yields using only the isolated, manipulated genes failed. They only succeeded, as the source recounts, when they included random bits of DNA, essentially as God provided it.
Wow. So in other words, the natural, unengineered parts were necessary for the invention to even work?
Precisely.
Yeah.
They demonstrated a dependency on natural processes they didn't fully understand, yet they still claimed the entire process and all future generations of Tracy as their patentable invention.
That is the pivotal maneuver, isn't it? Claiming ownership of the whole system, including its ability to reproduce, based on tweaking just one tiny fragment?
That's it. This reductionist approach reduces complex, self-organizing life to a mechanical, proprietary product.
This inconsistency, claiming nature when it's convenient and invention when it's profitable, it seems to define the whole regulatory landscape.
Yeah. It creates a completely opportunistic definition of natural. Corporations shift definitions based on whether they're claiming ownership or defending safety. So when seeking patents, the organism has to be defined as novel and non-natural, a product of the human mind, to justify the 20-year monopoly.
And yet, when facing environmental or consumer scrutiny about biosafety,
suddenly the definition flips. When arguing against consumer concerns or facing regulatory barriers, these same GMOs are presented as substantially equivalent to natural varieties and therefore safe. It minimizes the need for any stringent testing.
the text highlights a vivid case that captures this double standard. Herman the bull. What does Herman tell us about this?
Herman was the world's first transgenic dairy bull, engineered to carry a human gene for producing lactoferrin, a protein for infant formula.
Okay, so for patenting purposes, Herman and his offspring were definitely not natural.
Unequivocally, they were products of engineering. But when the product, the milk protein, was discussed for consumer consumption, Gen Farm's CEO insisted that they were producing those proteins exactly the way they're made in nature.
It's just an incredible contradiction. Non-natural for ownership, but natural for safety.
It reveals life being reduced entirely to its instrumental value. The cow, in this view, is just an instrument, a furry little factory designed for maximizing profit. And the source material draws a powerful parallel here, showing how this perspective extends to treating animals, women, and even children as mere instruments in a system of industrial production.
This instrumental view, this tendency to see life as a machine, it must have deeper roots. The text points to a deliberate effort to institutionalize this way of thinking in the early 20th century.
Indeed. This scientific paradigm shift was not an accident. It was financed and institutionalized. The Rockefeller Foundation played a central role, dedicating about $25 million between 1932 and 1959 specifically to advance molecular biology.
$25 million in that era is a huge sum. That suggests a major institutional goal. What was the aim?
The goal, as detailed in their own documents, was explicit: to create a new science of man, aiming for social control, and, critically, to naturalize hierarchy.
So to make social structure seem like a natural biological fact.
Exactly. This effort connected conceptually to the darker history of eugenics, seeking deterministic explanations for biological systems. This funding drove the prominence of the central dogma of molecular biology.
Can you just quickly refresh us on the central dogma and the critique from someone like Lewontin?
Of course. The central dogma is the linear idea that genetic information flows in one direction. DNA makes RNA, which makes proteins. It isolates the gene as the ultimate master molecule.
The blueprint.
The blueprint, yes. The critique, articulated by scientists like Richard Lewontin, challenges this linearity. Lewontin pointed out that DNA is chemically inert. It can't replicate itself or do anything without proteins, specifically enzymes, already in the cell. So in reality, proteins produce DNA, which in turn informs protein structure. It's a cycle, not a one-way street.
So the reductionist model favors a linear, predictable, machine-like process, ignoring the complexity and cyclical reality of life.
Precisely. And this brings us to the crucial difference between living and mechanical systems. The autopoietic versus allopoietic divide.
Autopoietic meaning self-organizing.
Yes. Autopoietic systems are self-organizing living systems. They're characterized by self-renewal, complexity, the ability to heal, a drive toward diversity. They grow from within. Allopoietic systems, like machines, are externally controlled, made from the outside, tend toward uniformity, and fail completely when a component breaks.
And the fundamental insight is that genetic engineering tries to force the mechanical allopoietic paradigm onto life, which is fundamentally autopoietic.
That's the crux of the critique. When you treat life as a mechanical construct, a gene construct, you reduce its degrees of freedom. You interfere with its self-organizing adaptive capacity, and that increases ecological vulnerability because the system is less able to adapt to stress.
This instrumental view is then directly responsible for the ecological risks of releasing GEOs, what the text calls biological pollution. What are some of those risks?
The risks are structural to the technology. The creation of GEOs often involves vectors, recombinations of genetic parasites, often viruses, which are tagged with antibiotic-resistant genes. This raises serious public health concerns about creating new pandemic bacterial strains resistant to current antibiotics.
And this isn't just theoretical. The sources provide field test evidence that contradicts corporate safety claims.
The evidence is compelling. Take the Oregon State University study with engineered Klebsiella planticola bacteria. This was designed to convert crop waste into ethanol, which sounds good.
Sounds great, actually.
Right. But researchers found that when released in certain soils, the bacteria killed all the wheat plants. And even more concerning, in all test cases, it reduced the vital mycorrhizal fungi, which are essential for soil health, by over half. This was an unpredicted, serious, system-wide ecological effect.
A huge ripple effect, and then there's the problem of superweeds.
A critical problem. The Denmark study on herbicide-tolerant oilseed rape showed that this transgene readily transferred to its weedy relative, Brassica campestris. The hybridization rates are alarming, between 9 and 93%.
So you're basically creating uncontrollable weeds that are immune to your own herbicides.
In a nutshell, yes. And the ultimate outcome is a system where companies profit regardless of the ecological fallout. Benefits are privatized, but costs are entirely socialized. The history of brain cotton in India makes this crystal clear.
Tell us about that case.
Well, Monsanto marketed its Bollgard cotton with a compulsory technology fee of $79 per hectare. It generated huge profits for them, $51 million in just 1 year. This was for season-long plant control.
And what was the actual result for the farmers?
It failed spectacularly in many regions. Bollworm infestation levels soared to 20 to 50 times the typical spraying trigger level.
So after paying the exorbitant fee, they still had to spray more.
Way more. They fell into massive debt spirals. And the injustice is magnified by the input cost. Traditional seed used to cost about 9 rupees a kilogram. The patented BD cotton seed skyrocketed to 1,800 rupees for a tiny 450-gram packet.
That economic shift from low-cost regenerative input to high-cost proprietary input immediately traps the farmer.
It does, and the IPRs formalize that dependency. Monsanto licensed farmers only to use the seed for one crop, forbidding them from saving or selling it. So the corporations reap millions while imposing ecological havoc and financial ruin. It's a systemic failure where all the risk is transferred onto society.
Moving into Chapter 3, we shift from that philosophical reductionism to the concrete implications for agriculture, positioning the seed as the ultimate target of this new kind of colonization.
That's right. The source material connects us back to historical biases, what it calls patriarchal dualism. Historically, male activity production, spirit, culture, was defined as superior and active.
While female activity regeneration, matter, nature was seen as passive.
Deemed passive or non-productive, exactly. This historical devaluation of regenerative work set the conceptual stage for modern capitalism to devalue nature's capacity for self-renewal.
The text then argues that capital, having depleted external resources like land and forests, is now looking for new frontiers to exploit.
Exactly. The new colonies are identified as the interior spaces of the bodies of women, plants, and animals. And the seed, as the embodiment of life's regenerative power, is the prime biological target. Capital's patriarchy reconstitutes the seed, treating it as a passive container for the engineering mind, which is seen as the only source of creativity.
So the seed's most fundamental trait, its ability to reproduce itself, becomes the core biological obstacle that capital has to eliminate.
That is the crucial insight. The seed is unique because it is both the means of production and the product. So modern industrial breeding, like hybridization and, of course, strict IPRs, are all attempts to remove this obstacle,
To break this cycle.
to break the cycle. The goal is to transform the renewable, self-regenerating seed into a non-renewable raw material that must be repurchased every single year. This rupture is the engine of dispossession.
This sounds conceptually identical to the historical justification for seizing colonial land. The source draws a direct line through the concept of nullius.
It's a precise application of historical legal precedent. Colonizers used Terra Nullius, the idea of empty land, to deny the rights of indigenous people, arguing they hadn't improved the land by European standards.
And now we see the same logic applied to biology.
We see a move to Bio-Nullius, which means life empty of intelligence. The land races developed by farmers over 10,000 years are dismissed as primitive cultivars. They're only seen as having value once they're improved in a corporate lab. This allowed the Green Revolution to displace regenerative systems with linear chemical flows.
Treating the earth like a factory floor.
Exactly. And the long-term environmental costs were profound. The chemical dependency led to severe soil degradation, depleting micronutrients, and the massive application of nitrogen fertilizers increased greenhouse gas emissions, specifically nitrous oxide. It was a structural failure.
This highlights the corporate assumption that 10,000 years of cumulative innovation by farmers is somehow valueless because it's not industrial.
It is the ultimate intellectual theft. Pat Mooney is quoted in the source arguing that recognizing intellectual property only when it's produced in labs by men in lab coats is a fundamentally racist view of scientific development.
It favors one model of innovation and dismisses all others.
And this theft is enforced through IPRs, which the source material claims are less about invention and more about exclusionary control. This is why the distinction between different forms of intellectual property is so important.
Like plant breeders' rights versus utility patents.
Right. PBRs were traditionally narrow. They granted a monopoly only over the marketing of a variety and usually included a farmer's privilege to save seed and a research exemption for other breeders.
But the utility patent is far more expansive.
Significantly. Utility patents are broad, total forms of enclosure. They can cover entire plants, genes, and even abstract characteristics. The example of sun gene is highly instructive. They patented the characteristic of high oleic acid content in a sunflower.
So not just one plant, but the trait itself.
Yes, which meant that no matter how another company developed a high oleic acid sunflower, sun gene could block them, effectively monopolizing a biological trait.
If the patent covers the trait, the farmer is left with virtually no autonomy. This relates back to the right to make the seed versus just the right to use it.
Exactly. The patent system grants the farmer the right to use the seed to grow a crop for one season, but it explicitly denies the inherent right to make it, to save, replant, or share. This is the goal Hans Leanders of the seed industry articulated, abolishing the farmer's right to save seed entirely.
It turns the farmer from an autonomous producer into a dependent consumer.
And when you look at the total value generated by traditional agricultural knowledge, the idea of third world piracy seems completely reversed.
The RAFI calculations.
That's the one. The Rural Advancement Foundation International calculated that if the contributions of the third world's genetic diversity to global agriculture and pharma were properly valued, the U.S. would actually owe the third world $2.7 billion annually.
It completely reverses the debt narrative.
It exposes the current system as a profound wealth drain from the global south to the north.
And to maintain this structure, the source identifies two key political constructs: the production boundary and the creation boundary. How do these invisible lines work?
They're designed to render essential work and knowledge invisible. The production boundary excludes all regenerative and subsistence work, women's household labor, farming for self-consumption, from being counted in systems like the gross national product, the GNP.
So by not counting it, they can treat these groups as non-productive.
And justify marginalizing them politically. And the creation boundary does the same thing for intellectual property. It excludes the creative contributions of women and third world peasants, defining their knowledge as mere biology or tradition.
Justifying corporate appropriation.
It justifies it by claiming the knowledge only becomes valuable once it's formalized in a Western lab.
It's a mechanism for structural invisibility. Disturbingly, the source material draws parallels between this colonization of the seed and the mechanization of human reproduction.
The mechanization of the female body, much like the plant, follows this pattern of maximizing external control. We see this with the rising use of cesarean sections.
Also,
The C-section, requiring maximum doctor management, is often promoted as the method that produces the best product, even if it carries greater health risks. C-section rates have soared to 75% in places like São Paulo, Brazil. It's a professional takeover of a natural process.
this pattern also manifests in the legal ownership of reproductive outcomes.
Precisely. Knowledge and ownership are transferred from the biological mother to the specialist or the patriarchal capital contracting the process. The Baby M case in 1986 is a powerful illustration. The judge ruled a contract concerning a man's sperm was sacred, while reducing the biological mother's pregnancy to that of a surrogate uterus.
Her contribution was minimized while the fragmented, contracted part was elevated.
It shows the fragmentation strategy in action. Just as a gene is isolated and patented away from the plant, reproductive functions are fragmented and appropriated. This is highlighted by the absurd patent application for the human relaxin hormone, naturally synthesized in female ovaries, which was sought by 3 male dentists.
Just unbelievable.
It illustrates the system's ability to acquire and claim ownership over biological material through technological fragmentation, completely ignoring the origin.
Chapter 4 shifts our focus to the broad landscape of biodiversity and the specific knowledge systems used to manage it. This is where the conflict between local rights and global corporate claims really comes to a head.
This chapter clarifies a crucial point that's often distorted. Biodiversity is not a global commons like the high seas or the atmosphere. Biodiversity exists in specific countries and specific ecosystems and is actively conserved and used by specific communities.
So what is the central conflict the source identifies?
The conflict is the conversion of biodiversity. For local communities, biodiversity is a life support system. It provides food, medicine, energy, especially for the poor. The rise of new biotechnologies converts this vital resource into raw material for powerful global corporations, leading to direct dispossession.
This conversion process is what allows biopiracy to flourish. The most famous example detailed in the book is the case of the neem tree.
The neem tree case is a classic example of blatant biopiracy built on that Bio Nullius concept. In India, the neem has been central to agricultural and medicinal practices for over 2,000 years.
As a biopesticide, for medicine, even for dental hygiene.
Exactly, using the name Dayton twig. This is collective, publicly available meta-knowledge.
Yet the American company W.R. Grace, along with the USDA, received a patent. How on earth did they justify claiming invention over something that had been in use for 2 millennia?
Their justification was that the fungicidal properties were only recognized as novel because they had developed a modernized extraction process.
That's it, a new way of extracting it.
That was their claim, that their method constituted an inventive step, completely ignoring the millennia of prior knowledge that first identified the property. This is the mechanism. Claim petty technical tinkering as creation while redefining vast traditional knowledge as non-science.
Was this challenge successful in the end?
It was a long fight, but yes. The European Patent Office finally revoked the patent on the grounds of lack of novelty and inventive step. This legal victory was highly significant because it was a recognition within a Western legal framework that traditional collective knowledge constitutes prior art.
This systemic search for valuable genetic resources has been branded bioprospecting, which the text likens to resource mining.
And that mining metaphor is an ideological tool. It assumes the resource lies buried, unknown, unused, and without value until the corporate prospector shows up.
Which hides the fact that local communities already knew about and used these resources.
It completely obscures it. The data shows 75% of plant-based drugs globally rely on leads derived directly from traditional knowledge. The prospector isn't discovering anything, they're capitalizing on pre-existing intelligence.
To mask this, corporations often present contracts designed to show equitable sharing. Do these agreements actually work?
The source material argues they often function as an illusion of equity because of the immense power asymmetry. The 1991 Merck and Bio agreement in Costa Rica is the archetypal example. Merck paid $1 million for exclusive worldwide access to plant samples from rainforest parks.
$1 million sounds like a substantial sum for a developing nation.
It is, but it was a deal struck between a massive TNC and a small non-governmental conservation group. It entirely sidestepped the legal and political rights of local indigenous communities and the Costa Rican government.
The actual custodians of that biodiversity.
And furthermore, the supposed capacity building promised to the University of Costa Rica was compromised. When Merck supplied equipment to the university, It ensured that facility would then be used almost exclusively for Merck's proprietary research. The capacity building became captive infrastructure.
So all these fragmented efforts to gain control were eventually institutionalized and legalized on a global scale through the TRIPS agenda.
The Agreement on Trade-Related Intellectual Property Rights, yes. And the history of TRIPS is a remarkable story of corporate influence. The source highlights that the entire framework was drafted by the Intellectual Property Committee, the IPC.
A coalition of TNCs, right? DuPont, Merck, Monsanto.
All of them. James Enyart of Monsanto stated that the IPC acted as the patients, the diagnosticians, and the prescribing physicians. They wrote the law they wanted.
What were the core objectives of the TNCs that were codified into TRIPS?
They aimed for 3 critical changes. First, to expand patentability to all life forms, including plants. Second, to force product patents in sectors like pharmaceuticals. This was vital because many developing countries allowed only process patents, meaning they could legally imitate a drug using a different process to provide cheap alternatives.
And product patents shut that down completely.
Completely. And the third objective was to severely shrink public interest safeguards, like compulsory licensing in a health emergency. TRIPS defined these essential public welfare mechanisms as discrimination or abuse of IPRs, forcing nations to dismantle systems designed to protect their own people. This is the definition of bioimperialism.
This aggressive expansion of proprietary rights has, predictably, sparked significant resistance.
Yes. The text details the growing counter-movement, particularly in India. Farmers launched the Seed Satyagraha, a non-violent struggle for truth and rights regarding seeds, and asserted Samuhik Gyan Sanad, or collective intellectual rights.
A rejection of the idea that one person or corporation can own knowledge derived from centuries of communal innovation.
Exactly. And the alternative proposed in the source to counter this bioimperialism of TRIPS is a call for unique systems of rights based on biodemocracy.
Meaning
the equal validity of all knowledge and production systems, including the collective, regenerative, and traditional knowledge held by peasants and indigenous groups. This is the necessary philosophical foundation to counter a system that assumes only Western industrial knowledge deserves legal protection and profit.
This analysis of chapters 2, 3, and 4 has thoroughly detailed the interlocking systems of intellectual and legal enclosure that define biopiracy today.
We have established how the legal mechanism of the patent relies fundamentally on defining life as a machine or an invention, a denial of its complex, self-organizing reality.
Right. And this denial allowed the historical colonial pattern of dispossession to be revived through the concept of Bio Nullius, dismissing farmer creativity to justify the colonization of the seed.
And finally, we saw how global trade law, particularly TRIPS, was engineered by transnational corporations to convert local biodiversity from a vital life support system into profitable raw material, exemplified by that fight for the neem tree. It really reveals the highly structured scaffolding that supports modern biopiracy.
A powerful and sobering analysis.
The struggle articulated in these chapters is about resisting this reductionist paradigm and protecting the knowledge commons and biological diversity necessary for ecological and social resilience. The mechanisms of enclosure are powerful, but so too is the assertion of collective rights and biodemocracy.
The conversation continues with the analysis of the next part. In this last part of the analysis, we're shifting gears a bit. We're moving from the more, theoretical architecture of biopiracy.
Right, the legal frameworks and concepts.
Exactly. And we're moving now to its blunt, tangible consequences, what it actually does to the environment, how it creates instability, and maybe most importantly, what kinds of resistance are actually emerging.
Yeah, that's the key. We spent time establishing how these intellectual property rights, IPRs, were, stretched to cover life itself. Now, focusing just on chapters 5, 6, and 7, our goal is to really see the damage.
To see the scope of the violence, as the source puts it.
Precisely. To grasp how these global economic structures, all based on maximizing returns through, monopoly, how they fundamentally undermine both biological and cultural diversity, and then what alternatives are bubbling up from below.
We're going from the boardroom to the fields, basically. And the source material starts this section by going back to a core concept, a kind of conceptual violence that underpins this whole system. And that's the doctrine of Bio Nullius. Let's start there, because you really can't understand how this theft is even legally possible without it.
That's a great place to start. So the question that comes right out of the text is, what does the concept of Bio Nullius mean?
Right.
And it's basically the modern legal justification for biopiracy. It's a direct echo of colonialism.
Like Terra Nullius.
Exactly like Terra Nullius.
Yeah.
European powers used that idea that newly discovered land was legally empty, even if people were living there, to just seize territory. Nullius is the same thing. It says that life, seeds, traditional knowledge, it's all empty of intelligence.
So if the value comes from nature or from a whole community working over generations, the system just deems it worthless,
Yeah.
legally empty.
That's it. It assumes that all this knowledge needs a Western scientist in a lab coat, the quote-unquote inventor, to give it legal value. So centuries of farmers' innovations in breeding, that's just classed as nature or primitive.
It's not science.
It's not science. So a corporation can come in, make a tiny change, isolate one compound, add one gene, and then claim the whole thing as their invention, their property. That's the structural violence of it. It denies the creativity that's just inherent in nature and in collective human ingenuity.
And Chapter 5 really dives into how that philosophical idea becomes binding economic policy. It sets up this immediate conflict between traditional conservation ethics and, well, the ethics of corporate growth.
It pits the law of return against the logic of return on investment.
Let's explain that.
Well, the law of return is a basic rule of ecology. It's about mutuality, reciprocity. You take something, you must give something back. That's how systems sustain themselves. But when you replace that with the logic of maximizing return on investment,
The goal changes completely.
the goal immediately shifts to uniformity, monopoly. You can't justify the huge R&D cost of a patented product unless you can sell it everywhere, to everyone. You have to capture the whole market. And that drive for market share requires homogenization. It, by definition, destroys diversity.
And the global crowbar used to enforce this logic is the TRIPS agreement, trade-related intellectual property rights. We need to look really closely at Article 27.5.3b because that's the legal engine for all of this.
Oh, it is a masterpiece of, let's call it strategic ambiguity. It's written to make sure corporations win. It says that member countries may exclude plants and animals from being patented.
Okay, so that sounds like a safeguard.
It sounds like one, but it's immediately undercut because right after that it says they must protect plant varieties.
Ah, so you can exclude a whole species, a plant, but you can't exclude the one specific high-value variety that a corporation has engineered.
That's the loophole. They must protect those varieties either with patents or with what they call an effective sui generis system, a unique national system. The obligation to protect is absolute. It guarantees that the commercial value of seeds gets privatized.
And there was a review clause built in, wasn't there?
Yes. A mandatory review 4 years after it came into force. And that review became a huge fight. Developing nations, led by India and the African group, they argued that life forms should be completely banned from patents, that farmers' rights and traditional knowledge had to be protected.
The conflict became pretty clear at that point.
Painfully clear. The total incompatibility between corporate ownership of life and, the way ecosystems actually work.
Okay, so let's walk through the 5 critical ecological impacts that the source says this monopolistic control creates. The first one, and it's the big one, is the spread of monocultures.
Right. If you own the patent, you have to maximize sales of your one product. That means spreading your single, uniform crop variety across the globe, and in the process, you push out hundreds of local, diverse varieties. It's driven by profit, but it systematically destroys the genetic foundation of agriculture. It's an ecological landmine.
And the source gives this perfect, terrifying example of what happens when that landmine goes off. The U.S. corn blight epidemic in the early 70s.
It's a classic cautionary tale. By 1970, something like 80% of all the hybrid corn grown in the United States was genetically identical.
80%?
80%. They all shared this one specific trait, the T cytoplasm, because it made producing the hybrid seed really cheap and efficient for the seed companies.
So economic efficiency created this massive genetic bottleneck for the entire country's food supply.
Exactly. And because of that uniformity, when a fungus, the southern cornleaf, blight mutated into a new aggressive form, the entire crop had zero resistance. None. They were all uniformly susceptible.
And the result was?
Devastating. 15% of the entire U.S. corn crop was wiped out. Massive economic losses. It was this huge wake-up call that uniformity, while it might be profitable short-term, is just fundamentally unstable.
Okay, impact number 2. The increase in chemical pollution. This feels completely backwards from how biotech is often marketed, as this green solution.
This is where you see the real commercial agenda. Most of this research is driven and financed by the big chemical corporations. Ciba-Geigy, Monsanto, Hochist. Their goal isn't to reduce chemicals.
It's to sell more of them.
It's to develop crops that are resistant to their own herbicides. The classic example is Roundup-ready soybeans, which are engineered to survive being sprayed with Monsanto's own Roundup herbicide.
So you create a seed that then requires the heavy use of another product you sell.
It's a genius business move. I mean, from their perspective, developing a plant variety that tolerates a chemical you already sell costs maybe $2 million. Developing a whole new, less toxic chemical, that could be $40 million or more.
So this just locks farmers into their whole system.
It locks them in, it forces the integration of their seeds and their chemicals, and it guarantees that the use of their often pretty toxic chemicals actually goes up, not down.
The third impact feels like an escalation of the first one. It's the risk of biological pollution from genetically engineered organisms, or GEOs.
Yeah, this takes the risk we saw with the corn blight and just amplifies it with brand new gene combinations we've never seen before. The release of patented GEOs into the wild creates these unpredictable threats.
Like what?
The most immediate one is gene transfer, the movement of an engineered trait like herbicide resistance from the crop plant to its wild, weedy cousins. That's how you get super weeds.
Weeds that are resistant to all the chemicals we have.
Exactly. And the source makes a really important point here. It stresses that the third world is at a much higher risk for this particular problem.
Why is that?
Because those regions, India, Africa, South America, they're the centers of biodiversity. The wild relatives of our big food crops, they still grow there. So the chance of hybridization, of gene flow between an engineered crop and a weedy relative is way, way higher than it is in, say, North America. Releasing GEOs there is like playing genetic roulette in the world's most important library.
And to make this risk feel more real, the source uses some historical examples, even pre-GEO ones, that show how badly these introductions can go.
Yeah, these are powerful. Take the blue tilapia. It was introduced to a lake in Florida around 1970. Within 4 years, it had completely taken over. It made up 90% of all the fish biomass in the lake.
90%.
It just completely rewired the ecosystem.
Mm.
Or, even more tragically, Lake Victoria.
The Nile perch.
The Nile perch. It was introduced in the late 50s to boost commercial fishing. But it was this aggressive predator. It ended up driving roughly half of the 400 native cichlid species in the lake to extinction.
Half of them.
Gone forever. The ecosystem was shattered. And then there's the opossum shrimp, which shows even good intentions can backfire. It was introduced in a lake in Manitoba to be food for salmon.
But it didn't work.
It backfired spectacularly.
Mm-hmm.
The shrimp ended up eating the salmon's main food source, the zooplankton, and the salmon population just crashed. All these cases show the same thing. Ecosystems are complex. You throw in a new element, whether it's a new fish or a new patented gene, and the consequences are severe and often totally unpredictable.
Okay, the fourth impact is more ethical. The idea that IPRs undermine the very ethics of conservation.
This is a kind of moral colonization.
Mm.
Traditional ethics, from Buddhism, Jainism, Hinduism, they emphasize the intrinsic worth of life.
Mm.
A species has a right to exist just because it exists.
Not because it's useful to us.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
IPRs replace that with a purely instrumental value based on profit.
Mm-hmm.
And the way proponents get around this is they say, oh, a patent doesn't give you the right to do anything with an organism just to exclude others.
But the act of owning life is the problem itself.
That's the ethical breach. A patent gives you ownership rights over the entire organism, including its ability to reproduce, all its future generations. This idea that a corporation can own the regenerative capacity of a living being is just. It's completely at odds with basic conservation.
And that leads to the fifth impact, which is social, the alienation of local rights.
Right. IPRs strip away the rights of local communities, who have been the stewards of biodiversity for centuries. When you tell a community they no longer have rights to their own seeds or their knowledge of medicinal plants, you remove their reason to conserve those things.
Their stake in the game is gone.
It's gone. And the loss of biodiversity speeds up as a direct result. The source draws this amazing parallel to British colonial India.
With the enclosure of the forests?
Yes. The British denied local people their customary rights to use the village forests. Once those rights were gone, the incentive to protect the forest vanished. The forests were devastated, and then the colonial authorities had the nerve to blame the very people they dispossessed.
Which led to things like the forest satyagraha.
The nonviolent resistance. It's the same pattern today. Deny a community ownership of their seeds through a patent, and then blame them when that biodiversity disappears.
That's a really powerful bridge into chapter 6 because now the villain, this idea of uniformity, is shown to be the engine of social and political violence on a much bigger scale.
Exactly. The discussion broadens out. Diversity is the key to survival, to resilience in any system. But globalization is based on the opposite. It's based on homogenization, standardization, centralized control.
So from that perspective, diversity isn't a strength.
It's a problem. It's seen as inefficiency, as chaos, a disease that has to be streamlined so that capital can flow more efficiently.
And imposing that kind of social monoculture, it requires coercion. It's inherently violent.
It has to be. The world's diverse cultures would never voluntarily submit to that kind of homogeneity, so you need structural violence to centralize power and resources and enforce it. And just like we saw ecologically, that uniformity makes social systems incredibly fragile. The Green Revolution's miracle rice was so uniform it became vulnerable to new viruses, and when the crop failed, the society that depended on it failed too.
The source then maps this war on diversity onto history, using a three-way framework for globalization. Let's start with the first one, colonialism.
The first wave really established the philosophical violence. It transformed nature into just, dead, manipulable matter. It denied its ability to self-organize.
And that justified violence against nature.
And at the same time, violence against non-Western people, who were seen as part of that primitive nature, savages. This empire of man idea replaced reverence for the Earth family with a simple model of extraction and control.
Okay, wave 2, development. This looked different, it looked like help, but the source argues it deepened the problem.
Development was basically externally imposed guidance. The Green Revolution is the perfect example. The stated goal was peace and stability, more food, but it sowed conflict by ripping apart local social structures. It replaced these complex mutual obligations within a village sharing, helping each other out, with these rigid vertical links to the state and the market for seeds, for fertilizer, for water.
And the example used to show how that dislocation leads to actual violence is the Green Revolution in Punjab.
Yeah, Punjab is a tragic, essential case study. The Green Revolution created huge output, but it also created massive disparities. It drove farmers into debt to buy all the external inputs. It created intense competition for scarce resources like water.
And that economic pressure cooker just exploded?
It exploded into political and communal conflict. The traditional social norms that kept things stable were gone. So you saw ethnic and religious identities harden as groups fought each other for state resources. It led to this terrible spiral of violence in the 80s, things like the assassination of Indira Gandhi. The region's diversity was twisted into these destructive competing dualities.
Which brings us to wave 3, the current one, free trade. And the analysis is that this isn't free at all.
Not at all. It's asymmetric. It's mandated liberalization for developing countries, forcing their markets open, combined with intense protectionism for Western interests. Think of the U.S. Super and Special 301 clauses, which basically let the U.S. threaten sanctions on any country that doesn't enforce intellectual property rights the way they want.
It's a system designed to guarantee corporate freedom above all else.
That's the goal. And this is where we have to ask one of the core questions from the source material, because it gets to the heart of who built this system.
Okay.
Which corporations formed the Intellectual Property Committee, the IPC, the group that basically wrote these global trade rules?
Right, because this didn't come from governments initially.
No, the framework for TRIPS was largely conceived by the IPC, a group of major U.S. corporations working with their counterparts in Japan and Europe. The IPC was this incredibly powerful coalition of 12 American corporations.
Well, you should name them because the concentration of power is, it's pretty staggering.
It is. The 12 corporations that formed the Intellectual Property Committee were Bristol-Myers, DuPont, General Electric, General Motors, Hewlett-Packard, IBM, Johnson & Johnson, Merck, Monsanto, Pfizer, Rockwell, and Warner.
Wow, so you've got pharma, chemicals, tech, manufacturing, everything.
It's the whole suite. You've got the life sciences, DuPont, Merck, Monsanto, Pfizer. You've got foundational technology, IBM, HEP. It's all there.
And there's that quote from a Monsanto executive, James Enyart, saying they were basically the patients, the diagnosticians, and the prescribing physicians.
I mean, that says it all. The goal wasn't just harmonizing patents. The goal was control. Control over the basic inputs of human life, our health, our food, and our information. And this lobbying power created what the source calls the institutional trinity.
The WTO, the World Bank, and the IMF.
The new global authoritarian structure. They dominate economic decisions for developing nations, and they make sure that corporate freedom is always prioritized over everything else.
And the source details the social costs of this, mass unemployment and this concept of social dumping.
Yeah, the idea that to compete globally, developed countries have to lower their own worker protections and wages to match the low standards elsewhere, it's a race to the bottom.
But the ultimate violence, the analysis argues, happens at the subsistence level through structural adjustment programs, or SAPs.
This is the final deadly link. SAPs, imposed by the IMF and World Bank, force countries into harsh austerity. Currency devaluation, privatization, cutting subsidies for things like agriculture. This process just systematically destroys the ability of people to feed themselves outside of the global market.
And when those local economies are shattered,
Desperation leads to protest, which is met with repression. And that instability is often channeled along existing ethnic or religious fault lines. People are pitted against each other to fight over the scraps. The source draws these chilling direct lines from SAPs and commodity price collapses to the crises in Somalia and Rwanda.
crises that we often just blame on tribalism.
Right. But in Somalia, the collapse in the 90s was preceded by years of IMF adjustment programs in the 80s that destroyed their livestock sector, the backbone of their economy. The genocide there followed the 1989 collapse of global coffee prices, which was their main export. The World Bank and IMF then imposed severe SAPs. This accelerated the economic crisis and the social collapse, which then fueled the resentments that exploded into the genocide. Globalization didn't create the divisions, but it destroyed the economic and social systems that kept them from erupting into mass violence.
So after all that diagnosis of violence, Chapter 7 finally pivots. It shifts to the antidote, the conscious, nonviolent cultivation of a diversity.
This is the crucial turn. It says true peace can't be imposed from the top down. It has to be cultivated from the bottom up by reclaiming the right of things to self-organize.
Moving beyond just tolerating difference to actively protecting it.
Actively ensuring that diverse species and diverse cultures have the freedom to evolve and reproduce on their own terms, pushing back against the pressure to homogenize.
And this starts by acknowledging that there are two totally conflicting ways of seeing biodiversity.
On one side, you have local communities. For them, biodiversity is about survival, sustenance, conservation. It has inherent value. On the other side, you have commercial interests. For them, biodiversity is just raw material for a factory. And their profits depend on destroying diversity to create uniformity. The IPR system is designed to make sure the second paradigm always wins.
It does that by creating what the source calls a knowledge monoculture.
It's a great term. The TRIPS agreement only recognizes private, profit-generating knowledge, the kind you can write down in a patent.
So it structurally excludes everything else.
It excludes the entire intellectual commons, all the knowledge of farmers, tribespeople, nonprofit scientists. That knowledge is cumulative, it's shared, it's oral. By making that legally invisible, IPRs let corporations come in and pirate traditional knowledge about plants like neem or turmeric and claim it as their own invention.
You know, this whole reductionist paradigm, the science that even allows for this kind of genetic engineering and ownership, it didn't just happen. And this brings us to another one of those key questions from the source. Who financed the rise of molecular biology? Where did the money for this worldview come from?
And the source is crystal clear on this. The rise of this reductionist molecular biology was not some accident of pure science. It was a planned, heavily funded project. The primary patron was the Rockefeller Foundation, especially from the 1930s through the 1950s.
What kind of money are we talking about, and what was the goal?
Between 1932 and 1959, they poured an estimated $25 million into it. The explicit goal was to develop the human sciences as a tool for social control, to ground things like heredity, behavior, and equality in hard physicochemical terms.
So the science that enabled owning life was itself engineered to support a political project of control.
That's it. The goal was to naturalize hierarchy. If you can ground social differences in genetic determinism, you can provide a scientific-sounding justification for social planning based on selection. It was a new kind of eugenics, really. Reductionism was the chosen path because it led directly to economic and political control over the diversity of nature and society. You have to understand that financial history to see why our tech path aligns so perfectly with corporate monopolies.
So if that whole monoculture system is driven by this commercial logic, the source makes a powerful counter-argument. It says diversity is actually more productive.
Yes, it challenges the whole growth through uniformity idea. And the data is there. Look at traditional polycultures like the Indian Navdanya system, 9 seeds sown together, or Barnaja, 12 crops.
Just cropping.
Mixed cropping. These systems produce way more total biomass and nutritional output than a monoculture in the same space. They're also ecologically smart, they use resources better, they have fewer pests, and they include nitrogen-fixing plants so you don't need chemical fertilizers.
So if they're more productive, why did they disappear in so many
Yeah,
places?
they disappear not because they're unproductive, but because they require no commercial inputs. They operate outside the market. They are a direct commercial threat to the seed and chemical companies whose whole business model is based on dependency.
Which brings us to the response, the resistance. The seed satyagraha.
Yes, this movement in India, starting in the early 90s, was a direct response to the threat from GATT and its IPR clauses. And it revived these core Gandhian concepts for this new fight.
Okay, let's walk through them. First, Swaraj.
Swaraj is self-rule, local sovereignty. The farmers basically asserted that the natural resources of their village, the seeds, the water, the knowledge, belong to the village, not to the state, not to a corporation, a declaration of biological independence.
The second, Swadeshi.
Swadeshi is that spirit of regeneration, building from your own resources, your own skills and knowledge, instead of just passively accepting what's imposed from the outside.
And finally, satyagraha.
Nonviolent non-cooperation with unjust laws. The farmers declared their non-cooperation with the GATT Treaty, seeing it as a tool of colonization. They did this by openly saving seeds, defying the patent laws, and asserting their own rights.
So it wasn't just passive resistance, they were actively building their own alternative legal framework?
Absolutely. They asserted their Samuhik Gyan Sanad, their collective intellectual rights. This was a positive declaration that said any corporate use of their local knowledge without permission is theft. It's a way of building their own sui generis system that actually respects how their knowledge works as a commons.
And the seed itself becomes the symbol of this whole struggle.
The seed becomes the new charkha, Gandhi's spinning wheel. The spinning wheel was this small, humble tool, but it symbolized self-sufficiency against British industrial textiles. In the same way, the seed small, regenerative, diverse, it becomes this powerful, nonviolent symbol of resistance against the massive global forces that want to own life itself.
That is a profound way to frame it. It really does move this from a policy debate into something much more existential.
Well, if you pull it all together, the struggle against biopiracy is really a struggle to protect the freedom of diverse species and cultures to just evolve and self-organize. Accepting Nullius means accepting the colonization of life, a project financed by groups like the Rockefeller Foundation and enforced by the trinity of institutions built by the IPC. The cultivation of diversity, both in the field and in our ways of knowing, is really the only path toward genuine stability and peace.
That's a staggering thought, that the simple act of saving a diverse seed becomes a political act against this huge global architecture. This has been an incredibly powerful deep dive into the real-world consequences of all this. Thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive. If you found this discussion illuminating, please be sure to subscribe and follow our channel to ensure you catch all our future explorations of the subjects that truly matter.